Welcome to the Other Web. Our guest today is Valerie Friedland, a professor of linguistics at the University of Nevada, Reno, and the author of Like Literally Dude, Arguing for the Good and Bad English. Now, you might notice that in this episode, I play the part of a grammar Nazi. That's because I'm in the news business, so of course I'm a grammar Nazi. But I was curious to hear Professor Friedland's unusual take, where she argues that bad English is actually just as good, and there's really no point to label any particular feature of spoken language as wrong or useless. Let's follow this path and see where it leads. Professor Friedland, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you on. So, you wrote in a book recently that there is some good in bad English. Now, I'm an immigrant. I learned English from books. And so I have this idea that better English is better. What am I missing?
Well, you're missing the idea of what better English is. But I think that's a really common thing for people that are learning English as a second language, because you're learning the version that are put down in books, which is standard English. And even if you're a native speaker, we have these really strong opinions about good speech and bad speech. But I think we tend to not reflect on why we have those opinions and where they come from. They mainly come from the fact that that's what we've been taught in school as the proper form. And at the same time, we denigrate people that don't use those features. And if we think about who we're denigrating, it's usually the people with less power, sociopolitically, economically, ethnically. So it's really an ideology we have about who's speaking proper English and who's speaking so-called bad English that drives these opinions we have, rather than anything inherent in the linguistic system itself. Because as a linguist, I can tell you that African American vernacular English, for example, or Vietnamese English with a substrate from Vietnamese, or standard English are all valid varieties that follow linguistic rules. None of them break rules. They're not bastardizations of English. They're simply different variants of it. What we don't like are the speakers who speak it. And that's really where we get these ideas of good and bad English. And most of that came to us in the 18th century and when the rise of prescription happened.
So it looks like the example here is that local dialects or dialects of certain communities are perceived as bad, but in reality, they are just their dialects. But what if I just look at young people? And it seems like the younger a person is, the more filler words they tend to use, like, I mean, my parents, when I was growing up, called those speech parasites, which is probably a bit more direct than what Americans would call them, right?
I know I've heard some pretty bad words from Americans about them too.
So, do these elements have any redeeming qualities?
They do. I think there's two parts to your question there. One is whether young people indeed use those features more. And I will say that, yes, studies do suggest young people do it more. There are two reasons why young people do it more. One, because young people want to be anything that's not like their parents, and they have a different social value on language than adults do. So for most of us that work for a living and have children that we want to give the best opportunities in life, we're going to focus on using standard English and less slangy forms and less like, because that's what's going to get us where we want to be from a workplace perspective or from a parenting perspective. But when you're 16, you really could care less about what your parents want. And you certainly don't want to think about working for a living. What you want is cred, social cred at high school. You want people to think you're cool and you want to fit in. And that's going to be driven by doing everything your parents aren't and doing things that are slightly edgy and novel and new. And so for that reason, we find that young people pick up forms much more rapidly than older speakers, but also they innovate them because they get a lot more currency for the new and novel. And that's also when their brains are still more plastic and able to do more flexible linguistic things. And so what we find is when changes are in progress, meaning we're going from one older form to a newer form, like using about if you're an adult to using like as an approximator if you're a teenager, changes in progress always start with the young. So it seems like they're doing it a lot more because they are, but even as they age, they will keep that amount with them and it will be a new change. And that's what leads to change generationally over time. So both of those factors, being hip and new and also being more innovative and leading in change, tend to result in young people doing more of whatever it is we're noticing.
But if we set young people aside and we just focus on the idea of filler words, is there any benefit to having a sentence with 15 words, 6 of which do not contribute to the meaning of the sentence? Or is that always an unnecessary burden for the speaker?
Well, I'm laughing because, first of all, what I find interesting about language is how much we can say without actually saying it. And what was very clear in the way you stated that is how much you detest filler words.
I have to interject here and say that I have some filler words that I use that I notice myself using, and I think they are incorrect, but I understand why I'm using it. I was an engineer, right? I no longer do any software development, but I did software development for a long time. And what engineers tend to do is manufacture logical connections where there are none. And so we start sentences with "and so."
Exactly, because you're connecting, you're tying things together, you're doing the engineering in a sentence when you use those filler words. And it's the same thing as when you're putting pipes together or you're designing a building. It's not just the materials, right? When you're building a house, it's not simply having a stack of wood that gets that house built. It's understanding how to put it together in the right way and to make sure that you can communicate that to other people, so it turns out looking like a house and not a monolith or something like that. So I think when we have to reevaluate the way we look at filler words as the mortar to our houses, it puts our sentences together. It connects them in ways that are logical to others. And it also gives people a sense of what we mean when we're saying something. So it can tell someone, I have a very strong opinion about this. It can tell someone, I'm really not sure about this. It can tell someone, I'm estimating this is not exact. So, for example, when I use a like as a connector and I'll say, I don't think he's going, like, I'm not sure, but he told me he wasn't feeling well. That like actually connects those two sentences to say, this is a continuation of that thought. And I'm going to tell you more information about it. But it also provides an estimate of my certainty. So it's essentially an approximator saying, I'm not 100% about this. I'm just telling you this is what I think. Whereas if I say something like therefore, which is also a filler word in many ways, because it also does this connection. We call it discourse markers, not filler words, but it serves that purpose. That's sort of saying, okay, here's the logical conclusion of what I just said. So again, it's connection. It's just different types of connection. What we find is when people don't use them, and there are people that are very adverse to filler words or discourse markers and they try to limit them in their speech, they actually come across as less sociable and more robotic in their interactions with people, and they tend to be less well liked. So from that perspective of sociability, it tells people, hey, I'm working with you so that we can come up with a shared understanding. But from a purely semantic standpoint, you're correct that if I say like out of context, I could take it out of that sentence and it doesn't really change the meaning, but it does offer pragmatic information, which is contextual or situationally bound meaning that I'm trying to get across to you. And that can be either how I feel about something, how certain I am about something, or whether I'm changing direction. So, for example, I just had a reporter contact me about Biden's speech, and they said that he often falls back on two things as discourse markers. He either starts a sentence with, look, this is blah, 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 blah. Or he says, by the way, blah, 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 blah. Well, both of those are discourse markers. You could take them out and they don't contribute meaning. But look starts a sentence by saying, I'm making a point here and it's a strong one and I'm pretty certain about it, right? It prefaces his certainty about what he's going to say, and it's trying to get the listener to pay attention. But when you use by the way, what that means is I'm actually about to tell you something that's not directly related to what we just said, but I feel it's an important thing for you to know. So it prefaces, okay, this isn't connected. This is actually something separate. It's an aside. So again, they contribute some sort of meaning. It's simply not the semantic or literal meaning that we tend to think of when we talk about sentences.
So every example you've given to me seems like it's meaningful. It serves a role. Look, obviously is not a part of the sentence, but it is a specific separate sentence that kind of tries to get somebody's attention, right? But the way I just used kinda in the sentence doesn't seem like it was very meaningful, right? Or if I say, and I was like thinking like, what do I like do? Did those 3 likes contribute to the meaning of the sentence, or were they essentially
something I said because I didn't want to just pause?
I think you would have to say, as a linguist, we have a lot of evidence that like serves a purpose. And there are a variety of ways we know this. One is if you look at like use, and I make my students do this every year because they're very nervous about their likes. Young people are nervous about like because they get shit for it a lot from their parents, from teachers, from, grandpa. And so they always come into class saying, I know I do this a lot and I can't stop myself, but it really bothers me that I use like all the time. So I make them actually record themselves in a conversation and then analyze their like use. Because what I'm trying to show them is while people tend to think it's meaningless, just like you suggested, if you actually look at how it patterns, one of the reasons it's so prevalent is there are several different kinds of like, and they do very different things for us. There is the like that is an approximator instead of about. So I could say something like, I ran, 5 miles. I could say I ran about 5 miles. But what that is a generational difference in who prefers which one. About isn't meaningless in that context. So why is like meaningless? What we're really saying is, I just don't like. It has nothing to do with the meaning because it is meaningful there. The ones that I think really get people's goat are the discourse marker likes that occur at the beginning or in the middle of a sentence where they sort of come before either a phrase or a sentence. And what they tend to tell is that we're using sort of a subjective sensibility in how we're expecting someone to interpret our sentence. And if you look at the history of like has always expressed similarity or resemblance. Historically, in the 13 and 1400s, that's all it did. But over time, in the 1600s, we see it start to express metaphorical similarity. So something is inexactly described using a metaphor or a simile, right? Well, that meaning then gets detached from that use and instead just starts to mean I'm saying something that resembles this thing. It's not exactly like that, but it's sort of like that. So what it's communicating when I use like as a pre-sentence particle or in the middle of a sentence is I'm not 100% sure. That doesn't mean I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm not 100% sure about the certainty of what I'm telling you, or I want to get across that it's not an exact match to how I'm feeling, but I'm estimating it. So it's really estimation that it's contributing. And I know people don't like that because everybody wants exact and pure and clear language, but that's not unclear. It's simply saying, look, I don't exactly have the words to express what I'm saying, and therefore I'm indicating that by using this like. The third like is a quotative verb where we're using it instead of the verb to say. He was like, I don't think I'm going to go. And I was like, why not? Well, again, it's just a matter of our choice of which verb we're using. An older person might use say in that context, but what you lose with say is that sense that it might not be a direct quote. If I say, John said he doesn't like you, you're going to be really offended because you're like, I'm perfect. Why would John not like me? Because you're going to believe that he said that. But if I said, John was like, I don't like her, you might think, well, he didn't maybe actually say that and she's interpreting something, because like allows that more, hit or miss kind of, this is rough and ready kind of quote, not a necessarily direct quote. So it again gives us a little advantage over say. And when we look at literature that uses like versus say, we find that often people use that shift to display different character styles. So they're actually using it in a meaningful way. The third piece, or the probably 50th piece of evidence, because I've given you lots of examples, is that when we look at people telling stories and we ask someone else to tell the same story that they were just told by that person, they use like in the same place the original speaker did. And if it wasn't contributing something to the meaning, why would they do that? If they were simply just like users themselves, it should be idiosyncratic where they put those likes. But instead, they use it in specific spots, and they are the same spots the original speaker used, which tells us they, even though they might not be conscious of it, were using those likes for some purpose that they feel was conveyed by that original speaker. Therefore, it's in the same spot. So all of those suggest that they are doing something for us. I'm not saying people don't use them excessively sometimes. Think about it. I've just given you 3 different examples of like. If you're a speaker that has all of them, you can have a lot of likes in your sentence. And I will say that young speakers do show what we call age grading, which means they're learning a new feature and they're learning it kind of from a social stylistic standpoint where it has some power for them. And young speakers often overuse those features. And then it tends to atrophy as they get older. So yes, we do find excessive use among teenagers because they're using it for social power. As that social power becomes less relevant and they sort of don't need it anymore, they actually tend to decrease their rate. So parents around the world can breathe a sigh of relief.
Right. I want to go back to your penultimate example because that's one I wanted to bring up anyway. What I find is that often it's not a juxtaposition of say versus like. It's a juxtaposition of describing something versus demonstrating it. Where I would say, I was surprised. A younger person might say, I was like, oh my God.
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting because one of the really strong findings of research when we look at the distribution of quotative like is that it occurs mostly with first person narratives. And this seems to be part of a shift in our narrative style over the last 50 years, where we are wanting to always tell people how we feel about things. If you look back in early storytelling or early conversations that we have recorded before the 1950s, 60s, and that time era, what we find is people simply tell stories as facts. X happened, X went badly, and I went on my way. But in the last 30 years or so, we really seem to want to tell people not just the story, not just the information, but how we feel about that information. So the I has become more important in a story. And we seem to use like a lot in that context to indicate I'm conveying to you something about my emotional state at the moment. I was like, I don't like that. I was like surprised. So it's telling you, here's me. Here's me in the story. Whether that's good or bad, it really depends on your perspective, but we certainly have increased our need to tell people how we processed events versus just telling them about the event, if that makes sense.
It makes sense, though. I want to put the old scold hat for a second longer and ask, is this not just an attempt to avoid difficult vocabulary? Because I can describe the fact that I was surprised or flabbergasted, or maybe I was outraged. I can use words to describe what I felt in the moment that describe my feeling. Instead, if I demonstrate it, I don't need to use any complex words. I can use intonation or something like that. So it seems like an attempt to avoid thinking of the best word to describe it. It's just easier to demonstrate my reaction, and people will read my face and my intonation and know what I felt.
Well, two things there. First of all, I would love to hear you use flabbergasted regularly in a conversation and still have friends. Second, I think what we tend to forget is we always have these expectations that we're supposed to walk around being brilliant speakers all the time using, 500,000 different vocabulary words. And while we write that way, and that's certainly important in writing, we definitely value lexical diversity in that context. When we're just trying to talk to our neighbor over the fence, does that really matter? What is the point of language in that context? It's not to wow your neighbor that, I've learned the latest in linguistic fashions in my lexical choices. It's to communicate, hey, I saw a bobcat outside the fence the other day and you better watch your dog at night, or whatever the information you're conveying. And especially for young people, it would be something like, oh my God, that was a raging party. And if you want to talk about that really colorful vocabulary and a great diversity of lexicon, while we criticize young people for using a lot of like, we also criticize them for using an incredible amount of diverse new vocabulary at the same time. So we can't have it both ways. We can't say, oh, you're not using diverse vocabulary because you use like, and then also criticize them. Oh my God, I've never heard that word. That's a stupid word. You should get rid of that word, right? Because they're also responsible for innovating most vocabulary. So I think that's really a grammar maven reaction rather than a realistic one. The other thing is I would love to record someone in their everyday speech, which is where like tends to happen, and record an older speaker and a younger speaker and find out whether that older speaker really does use big fancy words like I was exhilarated and flabbergasted and surprised. They probably don't. Well, we can think of those as good replacements in our head when we're criticizing someone. When we actually would compare apples and apples, like an old speaker having a chit chat with their spouse versus a young person having a chit chat with their boyfriend or something, I would bet that the older speaker might not use like, but they're probably not using really fancy vocabulary in that context either. So I think there's a lot of complexity to that argument that is overlooked when we make it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure that older speakers use more complex vocabulary. It just seems like this particular feature is an attempt to avoid thinking of a word. You did allude to something that really interests me, which is the difference between the spoken language and the written language. I'm one of the odd people for whom, if you look at the transcript of the way I speak, it's actually not that far from the way I write because I learned English by reading. I think most people learn English by listening, and therefore their speech might be completely different from the way they write. But that leads us to trying to connect it to the previous questions, which is if the likes are very useful in speech, why do we not see them in writing?
You do in some writing, so in colloquial writing, and certainly writing has become more informal over time. That doesn't mean there's not still very formal writing that we do in scientific papers or political positioning and things like that. But if you look at texts over time, we do find an increase in its use. So if you do a Google Ngram for like, it's a little tricky because like also serves as a actual verb, so you'd find it more frequent that way. But you would still see a giant boost in frequency, and that's because we're seeing it more in writing because Google Ngram is all writing. But because this idea that somehow writing and speech are supposed to match up is a weird one, since for thousands and thousands, and we're talking 40,000 of years, spoken language existed without writing. Writing followed and only ever followed spoken language, and it took only certain aspects of spoken language and encoded it. So a lot of what we say in everyday speech, like I might say to my neighbor, "Hiya, how you doing?" I don't write that either. So there is a colloquial spoken language, and it is rarely matching the formal written language. I think where you're getting hung up is the standard formal speech is what tends to have been written. So when we get people that in the 1800s start doing a lot of writing, they're writing using the upper class standard speech forms because that really was prominent. And those were the people that were most educated, knew, and literate at the time. So that's what matches closely because that's what was written. Informal vernacular English was not what was written. So obviously the norms for writing is going to match where it came from rather than where it didn't come from, if that makes sense. And informal speech is always about speaking and connection, and written language is always about historicity and communication across distance. And that's very different purposes.
And that leads me to another question that I was really curious about, which is if I read historic writing, it seems like there's a simplification over time. That if I look at a 2,000-year-old text, it's very indirect. It's very colorful. There's always these subtle insinuations. People don't say yes. They say, do the flowers blossom in spring or something like that, right? And especially if you look at how politicians spoke, somebody said to Caesar, it will never be a direct sentence that means what it says. It's always some sort of subtle insinuation. And then even if you fast forward to 200 years ago, it's much more direct. There's still a lot of indirectness, but less. And you get to today, and even written language is just point blank says what it means. Is that an actual feature of an evolution that occurred? Or are we just looking at thinner and thinner slices of society and therefore getting the wrong impression that all of society just spoke indirectly?
Well, that's a really culturally loaded question in the sense that our ideas of directness and indirectness are very culturally bound, and we ebb and flow in how direct and indirect culture has been. And even English in its history has had a time where it was much more direct than today's English. So, you're talking about Greek and Roman literature, for example, and they really prized rhetorical strategy. And in fact, it was incredibly well studied. And there was a lot of discussion about, philosophical ways of language and thinking. And so it really grew into a very flowery, indirect language, because they spent a lot of time on the art of rhetoric, on how exactly to couch things in the right way, in the pure way, in the good way. So that was a culturally bound thing. And of course, the Greeks and the Romans were also really tied to prescriptivism. They had a really strong idea of what things should be like. And in fact, our parts of speech, we can thank them for coming up with that. And they talked a lot about the rules of language. So I think that's a very different culture than English culture. And if you actually look at the history of English, the Old English period was a time of great directness. The Germanic culture that founded Old English was actually quite direct, and they didn't have a lot of flowery language. And you didn't ever ask people to do things. You informed them they were going to do it, because the culture, there was no sense of self, right? It was all a community. And so you were expected to do your part, and you were tied to a certain rank, and you were never going to move out of it. So if someone said, take out the garbage, you did it. Versus today, hey, would you mind, sweetie? Could you please take out the garbage? Which is a very indirect way of telling someone to take out the garbage. So if you compare Old English to modern English is actually a lot more indirect. What you're talking about, this very flowery kind of language, which is certainly an early modern Shakespearean kind of feature, that really was introduced by the French in the Middle English period, because they had a very polite, courtesy-based linguistic style. And that came in with the court when the Anglo-Normans took over the court in 1066. And that really inspired this need for a more polite language. And in the early modern period, it was almost outrageous. If you read, this is where you're talking about, if you read text, asking someone to do something was 5 paragraphs long, because it was ridiculously flowery, and you are so great a man, and your wife is so lovely, and your children are beautiful, and oh my gosh, wouldn't it be lovely if they were able to go spend some time out in the countryside, and by the way, would you like to come to my country estate, right? It was this whole building up to get someone to do something. And from that, absolutely, we are less polite and more direct comparatively. But again, we went from very indirect, very kind of coarse language when blood feuding was more of an activity we did, to this, really sensitive to offending someone kind of behavior, to now being a little bit less that way. And so it sort of ebbs and flows. But I think the critical difference of today, which is getting at what you were talking about, I think, in terms of, are we moving to a different kind of cultural style, is that unlike the time when we're really worried about offending someone else in this very flowery language and sort of making people feel good about themselves, which is positive politeness, telling people, oh, you're so great and you're so wonderful, and it would be my honor and privilege for you to please come have dinner with me. Now we're really worried about being put out personally. So our sense of what's offensive has changed, and what's offensive to us today is to be somehow burdened or obligated to do things. And so now we're very careful about not making people feel imposed upon. And that's why we say things like no problem instead of you're welcome, because you're welcome is sort of making someone, oh, you're so wonderful, I'd be happy to do it. But no problem is you didn't burden me, it's okay. And so that's really the politeness shift we've had, and it has affected our language. Sorry, that was a very long answer to a short question.
It was a great answer. Though I keep thinking politeness is certainly one element, and some cultures are more polite than others. I lived in Japan. It has this feature where if I just take and transcribe a 2-hour meeting, then at least 1 hour of that was being polite. And then the other hour is content, which again, as an engineer, I immediately start thinking about efficiency. But I think about scenarios where probably you don't care about being offensive. Let's say you're a robber and you're trying to rob somebody in the middle of a highway, right? There are periods in which you say your money or your life. And there are periods in which you say, it appears that the gold is burdening your pocket. Let me relieve your burden, right? Both of those are give me your money. But there are periods in which you're just much more elaborate and colorful with how you say that, no?
I wonder if that's true or if it's the literary version. If you look at literature today or movies, a lot of times you have these more drawn out ways of responding to people or being sort of funny when you're doing something like robbing them. Whether that was really what robbers said at the time is harder to determine. So I don't know that we can really tie that to any trend that language universally does over time. I think when you're getting at different questions about complexity, though, there are certain trends we find universally in how language changes over time, the directions it moves. Politeness and sort of length of responses is probably driven more by what is at that moment culturally relevant. And at certain times it has been, let's talk more. And at other times it's talk less is better. I don't know that we can tie that specifically to some larger linguistic plan. Definitely language changes so that we tend to move away from really highly complex endings and inflections and tonal systems over time, because those are harder to transmit across generations. And so the natural direction of change is that those tend to go away and we get more simple in the sense of less complex patterning in our language, if that makes sense.
So last question about language before we move on to conversation, which is a slightly more complex version of the discussion. You mentioned that language evolves over time and you can track certain directions in which it tends to change. Is there such a thing as a good direction versus a bad direction, or is it all completely relative or subjective?
It's a very, very relative notion, because for every change that goes in the direction of maybe getting rid of something, like an ending, English, for example, had case endings, and now we basically have no case endings anymore on our nouns, except sometimes on pronouns. We have a few, but generally speaking, we don't have case anymore. It hasn't really hurt English over time. But what happened is because we got rid of case, we had to get word order. So for everything you give up, you gain something else. So there is really no good or bad in that sense. I think where the good or bad comes in is we tend to think of deletion or subtraction, so things that get smaller, like getting rid of a certain sound or something like that, as bad because somehow we feel like we're losing something, even though language always makes sure it keeps information clear. So we only lose things like a sound off an ending. So think of walk in, walking. If I said I was walking to the store versus walking to the store, that g sound you're losing changes nothing in your ability to interpret what I'm saying, right? You don't actually lose the ending, you just lose a sound off the ending. So the meaning's still clear. But if it was at a point where, okay, let's get rid of the ing and just have a little tiny vowel. I was walk versus walking. Well, that is problematic. Language never does that. It stops itself. It naturally, linguistically, cognitively won't let you do that kind of change. So there is no such thing as a worse change in that regard. What happens is we get changes that happen with people that we don't tend to favor socially. And that's how we start to dislike those things. So the people that drop G's more often tend to be lower socioeconomic class. They tend to be men, actually, and they often tend to be African-American in American English. Those are the highest rates of G dropping. And because those are groups like working class Black men are not exactly favored socially in America, we tend to then say, well, that's dumb speech, right? They are lazy, sloppy. We come up with negative adjectives to describe this thing that all of us do in other cases. Like, where did the D in handsome go, right? Where did the L in walk go? None of us say that because the same process of consonant deletion happened 500 years ago. Doesn't bother us, never changed anything. But when someone else does it that we don't really like, that same exact process that happened over time, then all of a sudden we're like, oh, that's lazy and sloppy and uneducated. So it's really in the eye and ear of the beholder rather than any actual linguistic better or worse over time.
And it's funny, if you had asked me, who do I think drops G the most, I would have guessed Appalachian.
Southerners, actually, white Southerners are high, but so this is where you get into the really interesting history of African-American English. So African-American English is a Southern variety. So the majority of plantation enslaved people were the birth of African-American English. The white varieties that they had contact with were Southern English varieties. So African American English actually started as a Southern English varieties. And many of the features of African American English are actually shared by working class white Southerners, because that is really the contact that they had. So actually, it's true that white working class Southerners also tend to have a very high rate of G dropping, and that's related to it being part of African American English.
Right, yeah. Going back to the 1920s Great Migration, I understand kind of how that unfolded.
Exactly.
I tend to talk a lot about that when people ask me, when I'm the interviewee, about AI, that we should look at the 1920s because something very similar is about to happen, just to different professions. All right. I should also mention that there's something you said that I haven't thought of, which is that there's this constant trade-off where if you drop a feature, then you have to acquire another feature to convey the same meaning. I speak Russian and Hebrew, and Russian is kind of unique in that it has cases, therefore word order is arbitrary. And it has a lot of prefixes that are used for verbs, which kind of increases your effective vocabulary. And one of the things that I think it causes is that Russians have no intonation. They speak really monotone because you don't need it to convey meaning anymore.
You don't
At least
need
that's my interpretation.
That makes sense. And there's probably you probably have some social import with intonation, so that you might do things with intonation for social meaning because you don't need it for linguistic meaning. So it's absolutely true. Yes. If you think about the languages, you can probably, and especially if you know their history a little bit, you can always figure out, oh, we lost that, but look, this came around, and it's often very small things like, well, we have to use word order, or we have to use adjectives or discourse markers, because when you have connections that are clear, some languages have actually markers, like you put on particles at the end to say, this is an object, this is a subject, this is focus, this is the focus of the sentence, right? They have topic markers. For example, Japanese, you actually put a particle on. Well, when a language doesn't have that, it has to somehow use strategies of conversation to point out, here's the topic of what I'm saying. English does that often by putting whatever's most novel and new in that case at the beginning of the sentence. So again, it's like these really subtle trade-offs where you don't have something, so you have something else.
Right. And yeah, I've had a lot of this language comparison because often I was asked to translate things because I happen to be the guy who speaks multiple languages. So I remember my chess coach, who was primarily a Russian speaker, would ask me to translate his ads into Hebrew. And I was often surprised how I start with 2.5 pages and suddenly I have 1 page at the end, because Hebrew is just much more compact than Russian. So,
oh, that's a great skill to have. So you get to see, and especially, English, Hebrew, and Russian are such vastly different language systems that it's really great languages to know, because you get a really, like if you speak Spanish and Italian, they're not much different, or Dutch and German, but Russian, English, and Hebrew, completely different.
Well, I'm not alone in that experience. I think there's at least 1 million of us who moved from the Soviet Union to Israel in 1990 and 1991.
It's very fortunate. It's a very fortunate thing to have such linguistic skill.
All right. Moving forward to conversation, which is what we typically use language for. Are there any rules that people should follow to have good conversations?
I don't like to think of them as rules. I think instead that we have guidelines that we as human language speakers tend to already know. And it can vary by culture. And that's where we get into trouble a lot, because we might have different priorities in how we understand how we should be relating to each other conversationally. But one thing is, there's a general rule called be cooperative. Right. That's part of what we call Grice's maxims, where it's just we have something called the cooperative principle, which is the guiding force of language, is that when we want to have good conversations, we need to be cooperative. Now, how that looks in different languages might be different, but there are some guiding principles. One, to be cooperative, we should be truthful. And this is why we get offended when people don't tell us the truth about things. Because even if it's an untruth that doesn't hurt us, so maybe it's a little white lie, our expectation is when we're in conversation that a good conversation is one where I can rely on that speaker to tell me the truth. And that's why we have this expectation that we should be truthful. But even more important, we should be relevant. And if sometimes, I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation with someone where you ask them a question and they say something so weirdly non-related that you're trying to figure out how it related and you can't figure it out. We often speak in ways that aren't obviously related, but it has to be recoverable from the listener's perspective to understand your meaning. Like, what were you trying to intimate by saying it that way? And so the other thing is that we have to think about when you say be relevant, it doesn't mean I always have to say an exact answer to your question. So, do you know John? Yes, I know John. You could say something like, I work at Inuit. And if the speaker knew that John also worked there, then they could take that as an answer. Yes, I know John. Right. So you don't have to say something that's directly relevant, exactly repeating the words, but you have to make sure that you understand what common ground you and the person you're talking to have. Because if you don't have a good understanding of that common ground, then what you say might not be recoverable for them, or it might not have the same impact, which is why sometimes you tell a joke, it falls flat, because you're relying on them having some background cultural information that they may not have. And so if you're not sure, a good way to do it is to say, oh, John works at Inuit. I work at Inuit. And therefore, or Intuit, I guess. What is it? Intuit, the company? It's a tech company. Anyway, at that company.
I would pronounce it Intuit, but I have no idea if it's correct or not.
Or Google, right? And then you just make it clear. So sometimes I think we make assumptions when we meet people about what they know and don't know. And maybe we shouldn't always make those assumptions. It never hurts to be a little more clear about your intentions and give information that might be necessary until you get to know that person better. So that would be one clue I would say that people should follow when they speak. And politeness can never go wrong. That's the other thing is I think, as you said, it feels sort of maybe like we're moving away from politeness. And I will say that certainly things are changing so that younger speakers might come across as less polite. One thing to understand is there's different cultural ideas about politeness and younger speakers have a different one. But I think for younger speakers, what's important to think about in a workplace environment, particularly, or when talking to people of a different generation, is that their rules for politeness might be very different than yours. And you do know what their rules are. They may not know what yours are because they're not as versed in it. So you can never go badly. It will never go badly if you err on the side of politeness versus directness.
Well, I think there are exceptions to that rule. I think if a Japanese person comes to Israel, for instance, and tries to err on the side of politeness, they will just never get the word in edgewise. It's not going to happen. So
yes, well, maybe in cross-cultural context, it's a little different.
There's one element of what you said that is interesting to me. You talked about cooperation being essentially that my answer has to relate in some way or be salvageable from the point of view of the listener. One of the odd features I often observe, and the moment I heard about it, I started noticing it in almost every single conversation, is this egotistical speech where you tell me you went to Greece on vacation and I listen for you to finish speaking so that I can tell you that I went to Argentina. And then you listen to me finish speaking and maybe I mentioned the steak. And then you tell me about the steak you had yesterday. And the entire conversation is basically each of us telling the other about ourselves and not asking a single question about what we just heard. Is that still cooperative or is that an aberration?
Strictly conversationally speaking, in the mechanics of conversation, it is cooperative. So no one is violating, this norm where we have some relation to what someone else said, but it's rude and it's self-centered. So that's a different question. I think you actually bring up a really good conversational agenda, is to be thinking more about what you can ask someone else than what you can say about yourself. It's what we find is even when we look at speeches of presidents over the last 100 years, when you look at what was expected in the early 1900s, we wanted presidents that talked about themselves. We didn't want them to be like us. We wanted to know, wow, you're way smarter than me and you know what you're doing. So let's hear from you. When you're giving a State of the Union address, I don't want to hear about what we should be doing. I want to hear about what you did. So we look before World War II, for example, State of the Union addresses used a lot of I pronouns. We measure presidents in the last 50 years, State of the Union addresses. They use a lot of we pronouns because what has become important to us is what we're doing, right? We want to be part of it. So I think the self, our image of self has really grown in importance, this idea of individuality and our self-importance, to the point where even presidents are now talking about us as a group rather than me as a person. And we find that good leaders, if we look at good leaders, they use inclusive pronouns rather than talk about themselves. So I think one strategy we should use in conversation is, what can I say that's really more about the other person than about myself? And a really good way to do that, if you're not sure about how to carry on good conversations, is ask questions. But you have to ask questions that are open, not closed. And that's the crux. So instead of saying, I really like X, what do you think? That's a question, but it's not a good question because it's still talking about yourself. What you should say is, what do you think about X? I'd love to hear your opinion on it. That's a completely open question without any kind of bias in the type of answer I want to get from you. And that is really a clear way to have a really good conversation where you're learning something new about the person you're talking with.
Another option, which I know Chris Voss talked about in negotiation, is to mirror something that the person just said back to them and then let them keep talking.
Right. Ask them or just build on that. That's always a great way, is in your questions. Because I think a lot of people enter conversations and they're a little bit awkward in what questions to ask. So, you walk into a party, you meet someone, you're like, so what do you do? Oh, you have any kids? And then you're out, right? You're like, I don't know what else to say about that. But if they say, oh yeah, I have 5 kids. I have Sally who, plays volleyball, and John who's an honors student. And then you can say something like, oh, really? What got her interested in volleyball? Or did you play volleyball? Right? Then you build on whatever they said by mirroring it. That's a really good way to continue a conversation that feels like it might get stilted.
There's another thing with questions that very often, one of the first things that an immigrant notices when they come to the US is that Americans often ask a question but don't expect an answer. Like, how are you is a question most Americans don't answer, and therefore most people don't expect an answer. And so when I say, great, how are you? People are surprised that they suddenly have to answer to that counter question.
Right. It's more like, I'm just acknowledging you as a human by saying, how are you? I don't actually want to know. I think it's interesting because I think a lot of Americans will say, good, how are you? Where it's just this rote answer. What really surprises people is when you say, actually not so good. I got this shoulder injury, and then, my wife left me. When you actually tell someone the truth about how things are, that's when Americans are like, wait, too much information. I had no interest. So it is a really funny thing, I imagine, as a non-native speaker. What does one say in Russian when you greet each other in that way?
I mean, first of all, if you greet, you greet. You don't ask a question. If you ask a question, you expect an answer for the most part, right? Though, again, you're talking to somebody who's never lived in Russia itself. I lived the first 6 years of my life in the Moldovan SSR when it was a part of the Soviet Union, right? It's just that we spoke Russian at home.
Right.
So, yeah, cultural differences are interesting. You mentioned Grice's maxims. Are there other maxims beyond the one that we covered?
Yes, there's 4 maxim. There's the maxim of quality, which is be truthful. So there are 4 maxims that should guide us in our conversations. One is be truthful, which is why if you're at a bar, I don't know if you've ever done this, but when you're a young woman in college, you sometimes will go out and just want a guy to buy you a drink. And when, girlfriends would do it, they'd make up these stories. They'd be telling these guys that they met that would be buying them a drink. And so they'd be like, I'm Jaja, I'm a Swedish model or whatever. They'd make up these ridiculous stories. And the reason that I think we got a kick out of it, of course, I never did this. It was only other people, is because it felt kind of violative of these rules we're supposed to follow. And that is because it actually is. One of the rules that we are brought up with is when we have conversations, we expect people to tell us the truth. So we feel a little bit dangerous, rebellious, and edgy when we lie. So the first is be truthful. And that's called the maxim of quality. Then there's the maxim of quantity. And that's a really interesting one. And also something people should be aware of when they're having conversations, which is we have cultural norms and expectations around how much information is too much and how much is too little. And I think, we were talking before we started recording about the difference in attitudes towards conversation of Finns versus American English speakers. Finns have a very different opinion about how much is too much than English speakers, or Israelis. Israelis and American English speakers feel a lot is good. Finns feel like less is more. And therefore, how we enact that maxim of quantity will be very different, which is why sometimes there are cultural misunderstandings between Finns and Americans. Like we get a sense that Finns are not very interested in what we're saying. And Finns are thinking, oh my God, would they shut up? Right? Because we have different norms around the maximum of quantity. And then, so that's how much you should say. And then there's the maximum of relation, which we already talked about, that we need to assume when we hear someone that no matter how off topic it might seem, that they intended it to be on topic. So that means sometimes if you ask someone a question and they give you an answer that doesn't seem to on the surface relate, as a good conversationalist, we should look for how that does relate, because we're going to have to make the assumption they were trying to make it relate. So a great example that's sort of a, comic one is if someone asks you out on a date and you're like, got to wash my hair. Well, that has nothing to do with going to a movie. Or if someone said, hey, you want to go to a movie? Got to wash my hair. But what it means is it was relative, because hell no was my answer. But someone coming from a different culture may not understand that because of the maximum of relation. They'll still be trying to look for how it relates. They just may not understand what the relationship is. And the final one is a little more complex. It's called the maxim of manner, which means don't be obscure or vague in the way you say things. And I think this one actually is really interesting because we often do use this in how we construct meaning when we want to be subtle about intimating something. So, for example, if you have a neighbor and they are married to someone you think is an asshole, you might say something instead of saying, Jane's husband is, over at the grocery store. You might say her live-in asshole is at the grocery store. Well, I'm being obscure and vague there because there's a better word that fits there. The word would be husband. That would be what I'd expect in that context because that's who he is. And that's a word we would all recognize their relationship in that way. But I didn't use that because what I wanted to also get across by being obscure and vague was I don't like him. Right. And so what was more important to me was getting across that meaning. And that's what we mean by be obscure or vague. And so when people are sort of prancing around the bush or they say something that's not as direct, we often interpret that as meaningful because of that maxim, if that makes sense.
Because they are probably passive aggressive is what they are.
Probably so.
All right.
Well, another good example would be if someone said, hey, what do you think about Bob and Carol? If you're at the office and you have some new colleagues and someone says, hey, what do you think about Bob and Carol? Well, they asked you about two people. And so you should answer about two. But if I said, well, I really like Carol, right? I'm kind of being obscure or vague. I'm not telling you the answer to the question, but what you're getting from me is like, Bob's an asshole, right? I don't like Bob. So it's meaningful because I violated an expectation that you have as a conversationalist.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. Last question. If there was one thing you could change, either in language or the way people use language, or the way people, especially people like me, view the use of language, what would you like to change in the world?
Oh my God, I just get to pick one thing. That's hard because there's so many things. But, one thing I would say, and the reason I've written my book, and I'm writing actually another book on accents and how they really represent different parts of our identity, is that we tend to be really uptight about language. And if you look back at the history of how we got to be here, of why we have the feelings and thoughts about language, and also why what we think is good English, it's really a socio-historical accident. And there's nothing linguistic about it. So my biggest message would really be, you don't have to like it. I'm not telling you to like, but I think you just have to be a little more empathetic for why we are doing the things with language that we do. And no one wants to go back to Old English. If you've ever read Beowulf or even Romeo and Juliet, right? In the early modern period was kind of tough for most of those ninth graders. No one wants to go back to that. And we've changed so much from then. So if it was okay to change from Shakespeare's time to now, why are we so uptight about small changes that are happening every day around us? So relax. I think that would be my one piece of advice is just chill out and relax about it.
For what it's worth, I've read a lot of stuff written in older days, and I don't think anything has been worse than John Locke. He's still the leader in my book.
Probably so. Probably so. I don't know. There's a lot. I've read some old manuscripts that are kind of scary. But yes, I think we are just very uptight. And the other thing is, we think a lot of what we're doing is new and it's really old. So discourse markers, which is something we started the conversation about, we kind of feel like those are new. That the annoying little particles we stick in our speech is something we're just doing now. But if you go back to Old English and you look at manuscripts, because obviously we didn't have iPhones to record ourselves back then, there's actually this one particle, the, that appears so often in manuscripts that it's basically been considered functionless or so multifunctional that it's essentially like a like is today. I mean, it can be in the middle, it can be at the beginning, it can be at the end, and some manuscripts will have like 10 in a row. So clearly, this was something we've always done. And if something is that necessary to language, that it appears in many, many languages and over time in the same language, that suggests it's doing something for us. So, I think we can learn something from history about what's good and bad rather than looking towards our opinions just based on who's the speaker is.
And I think Toastmasters is a pretty old organization. And for many years, they've had an counter, which means ums did not appear yesterday. They've been here for a while.
Yes, exactly. And funny thing is, I have a whole chapter in my book on and they're actually quite useful, even more than like. They serve really good cognitive processing purposes. So we find that people, for example, remember things better if it was prefaced by an or an. So if I said, yeah, I went to the store, well, and I asked someone an hour later where that person went, they'll actually remember it was store better than someone that didn't hear an there. So that's pretty impressive. But I've been invited to several Toastmasters after writing that book. And what I said is, and we might not like them, and maybe in a presentation we shouldn't use them, but again, relax. They're not the worst thing we've ever done in our lives.
All right, Professor Friedland, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I learned a lot. I'll try to be more relaxed, though, again, once you learn something, you think that what you learned is right. It's hard to let go.
It's really hard to let go. And I think, anybody who speaks 3 languages has some rights to be a little judgy.
I'll try not to be. Well, thank you so much for joining. It's been a pleasure.